Hi there, and welcome to Ukrainian Day at our Ukrainian Cultural Center located at 805 East Pender Street in the heart of the Strathcona community. We are continuing our day with a very special presentation, one called Costume Treasures from Baba's Trunk to the Stage. In a minute, we'll be showing you that video, but I would also like to remind our viewers that if you haven't yet had an opportunity to pre-order your pierogies and borscht items, you can do so now, and that at 2 p.m. the sales will be closing. So just if you want to get your order in, you've got approximately 1 hour to do that. And so the Costume Treasures is a very special production. It was one that involves a sharing of the history of costumes, taking them from the village into the concert stage, and sort of what it is that goes into that, doing the research that requires someone who's designing costumes to be able to take those costumes and move them onto the stage. And so I will, without further ado, let us watch the video, and then a little bit later we'll come back with Janice Beck to find out a little bit about the process that was involved in making that video. Thank you so much.
If you have come to an event at the Ukrainian Hall, you have probably seen our performers and even some of our volunteers dressed in colorfully woven and embroidered clothing representing our Ukrainian cultural heritage. We refer to this clothing as costumes, with the unspoken understanding that a costume is worn on special occasions, that it is out of the ordinary, that it allows us to be someone other than who we are in daily life, or it allows us to take on a new or unique persona. We see people wearing costumes in movies, on our computers, on stage, or on holidays such as Halloween, and we label most clothing outside of our day-to-day lives as costumes. However, by definition, the word costume simply means apparel or clothing, indicating a style of dress common in a nation, in a culture, or in a historical period. In other words, what we call costumes today were once the common daily and celebratory folk clothing of the people we are emulating. When Ukrainian settlers first came to Canada, they wore and brought with them the clothing they had worn at home for generations. This clothing included woven woolen, linen, and sheepskin pieces that were handmade. They were often richly decorated with embroidery, beading, applique, and leatherwork. These settlers were even called by many the men in sheepskin coats, as this was a common piece of their daily clothing. 130 years along, as the world has changed and cultures have assimilated, that original folk clothing is only taken out and used for special occasions, events, and performances, and has changed and developed for the stage to make it easier for the performers to wear and to make a more dynamic impact on the audience. When our Ukrainian Association first began providing cultural programs to its members nearly 100 years ago, people used their own clothing that would be worn on festival days as their performance costume. As the years passed, a standardization began to take place so that performing groups would look more cohesive and professional. Many of the original Ukrainian immigrants came from various parts of modern Ukraine, mainly from western regions that were then part of the Austrian Empire, including Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bohemia, so their folk clothing was often specific to the place their families once lived. The standardized costume became one that incorporated traditional elements of this regional clothing. Women wore embroidered blouses, ribbons, beads, red skirts, decorated vests, and floral headpieces, and men wore embroidered shirts and loose pants. These costumes were unique to the individual, as each person was expected to provide their own stage costume, handmade by their mothers and grandmothers. Each blouse, shirt, and vest was hand-embroidered with the patterns and colors of the village or region that family had moved from. The Ukrainian costumes our performers wear today are much more cohesive in appearance, but more representative of the wide variety of styles historically found throughout the regions of Ukraine. Originally, folk clothing was even more diverse as each village, town, or region used their own styles of embroidery, their own unique color combinations, local religious and mythological symbols, and materials that were locally accessible. Materials and dyes were made using the plants and natural fibers raised in farm gardens and fields. Factory-made materials were not readily available or were too expensive, so homespun and woven fabrics were used. Footwear was also made from local materials, but was reserved to be worn in cold weather or on special occasions. Today's stage costumes provide a more general set of characteristics for each region being represented. They are made with much lighter weight fabrics and decorated with threads that are synthetically dyed so that the colors remain vibrant. That being said, modern stage costumes do include the same basic elements that are seen in the folk clothing of all regions of Ukraine. Women usually wear a sorochka or long embroidered tunic, a skirt either full or made of wrapped fabric, a woven belt, a vest, a beaded necklace, boots or flat shoes, and a head covering. Men usually wear long, loose pants of varying widths, embroidered shirts, woven or leather belts, boots or flat shoes, a sheepskin vest or woolen coat, and a hat. This presentation will give you a look inside the rich costume wardrobe of the Dovbush Dancers and will provide some background about the different cultural influences and regions of Ukraine that they represent. Many of the first Ukrainians who came to Canada were from regions that are currently part of Western Ukraine, such as Galicia, Podillia, Rusinia, Volhynia, and Bukovina. The folk clothing, dance steps, and even language were often influenced by the neighboring countries and cultures, as the borders were often fluid and the distinct cultural groups did not reside within the borders of any one country. The region of Bukovina was the home of many early immigrants and was located between modern-day Moldova and Romania. The clothing, music, and dance steps of these cultures often overlap. The embroidery patterns of this region are reflective of the nature surroundings and villages. Heavy floral embroidery in a solid satin stitch is often found on the shirts, blouses, vests, skirts, and pants. For special celebrations such as weddings, the clothing would be even more intricately decorated, often with beaded embroidery and silver or gold metallic thread. This beaded outfit is typical of the wedding clothing worn by a bride in the Bukovina region, featuring rich floral patterns and bright colors. It is extremely heavy, as you can imagine, as the skirt is woven wool, the shirt is homespun linen, and they are both heavily embroidered with glass beads. This opulence is typical of wedding and ceremonial clothing in many regions of Ukraine, both as a display of wealth and as an expression of the symbolic wishes for future wealth, happiness, fertility, and luck in married life. When compared with the dance costumes from the Dovbush wardrobe, you can see the similarity of pattern, but the differences in weight and comfort of wear are significant. The women would wear necklaces of many strands of coral beads, including coins and medallions as good luck symbols and protections from evil spirits. The bride usually wore a special and very intricate headpiece, either a vinok or wreath, or a floral crown decorated with beading and ribbons. One of the most important rituals was the changing of the bride's intricate headpiece to the linen head wrap that she would wear as a married woman. The regional Bukovinian costume that is part of the Dovbush wardrobe is similar in composition to the wedding outfit, but is made of much lighter materials. The shirts are usually styled with open sleeves and lace trim, and the vests are often lined and trimmed with fur. The original vests would likely have been made of sheepskin, as were most of these clothing elements in the regions of western Ukraine. The Bukovinian skirt, or horbutka, is made of a length of woven fabric wrapped and tied at the waist. Because it is so narrow, the distinctive style of this region is for one or both sides of the skirt to be lifted and tucked into the waist for ease of movement. The man's shirt is tunic length and usually left untucked, again for ease of movement and coolness when working. For the stage, these pieces have been modified by using synthetic cloth fabric and cotton embroidery thread to allow for comfort and easier movement for the dancers. The characteristic dance steps of Bukovina are quick, intricate, and feature syncopated stamping combinations. The dance Bukovinska Suita highlights the steps and character of this region of Ukraine. Another western region of Ukraine where immigrants in the first wave came from is Zakarpattia, or Transcarpathia, a region of southwest Ukraine in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. Settlers from this region were known as Ruthenians when they arrived in Canada. Transcarpathia is bordered by Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and the folk clothing and dance steps of this region show influences of these cultures. Although the basic costume elements such as a skirt, blouse, vest, boots, and head covering made up the complete outfit, each element is decorated in patterns and colors unique to the region and reflecting the influences of the surrounding cultures. The use of smocking or gathering of fabric is extensively used on sleeves and shirt fronts, and high gathered necklines are common. Intricately beaded choker-style necklaces were often part of the women's festive clothing. The costume for the dance Bereznyanka is very specific to the event it is representing. Bereznyanka means wedding dance, and the colors and design elements of the clothing are representative of those used for celebrations of matchmaking and marriage. Blue is considered a color representing the sky, water, and purity, so blue and white designs are used in many regions of Ukraine for wedding celebrations and in Ukrainian dances with themes of love and romance. The full skirt of the woman's costume is similar to the skirts of traditional Slovak, Czech, and Hungarian clothing, and the narrow pants with the scroll detail are similar to the folk clothing of Hungary and Slovakia.
Okay.
In the small villages and towns, the daily folk clothing of the Transcarpathian region would likely be a simpler version of what we present on stage. For example, the amount of embroidered decoration, the fullness of the fabrics used, and the brightness of the colors chosen would be much simpler for the clothing worn at home and at work. Women would have worn their sorochka or tunic without an overskirt, but with a wide apron to protect the fabric. The more decorative of these elements would be saved for the clothing to be worn on festival days spread throughout the yearly calendar. The variety of designs and colors varied from village to village, encompassing both symbols from nature and geometric patterns and designs. The Transcarpathian costume enhances the dance steps seen in this region with circles, turns, and movements that are made more dramatic by the fullness of the costume pieces. This costume has a distinctive Hungarian feel, and the dance krutak that the dancers perform when wearing it has distinct Hungarian elements as well, particularly the kyuch, or key step that ends many of the dance phrases. By far the largest group of those first settlers coming to Canada from what is today Ukraine were identified as Galicians. They were easily recognized by their distinctive wool and sheepskin clothing. The Carpathian Mountains lie in the area known then as Galicia, and the range extends through much of Eastern Europe, including the Ukrainian region of Bukovina and into the northern parts of Romania. The Hutsuls lived in this mountainous area, herding sheep in the mountain valleys, hunting, fishing, and woodcutting in the forested mountain slopes, and making beautiful artifacts out of wood and leather. These were the fabled men in sheepskin coats, spoken of in Canadian press and historical record. The traditional folk clothing of the Hutsuls was designed for the high altitudes, forested slopes, and cold temperatures of the Carpathian Mountains. Fur-lined sheepskin vests and coats were worn by both men and women in the winter. In warmer weather, these were replaced by felted wool vests and jackets. Tunics and shirts were usually made of homespun and woven wool with outer pieces made of heavier woven panels. Footwear in the summer consisted of flat slippers woven with reeds. In colder weather, the common footwear was pistole, a flat leather slipper highly decorated and worn with heavy woolen socks. Throughout Ukraine, boots were a luxury for most people, but have become a common feature of the stage costumes worn today. In the western Ukrainian regions, when boots were worn, they were usually black. The colors used to decorate Hutsul clothing are reflective of the mountainous environment the people were surrounded by. Green, yellow, orange, and red are commonly used, and the embroidery designs often include patterns from nature being represented through geometric shapes. Embroidery on shirts and shifts was done with naturally dyed linen threads, and kiptars and serdaks, in other words, vests and jackets, were embroidered with wool or embellished with leather and cloth appliques. The women's skirts were an apron style with separate front and back pieces, usually woven in a striped pattern and varied in length from village to village. Their intricate headdresses were also made of natural materials, decorated with woolen tassels and pom-poms. The men wore brimmed black felt hats or black or gray sheepskin caps. The most distinctive feature of men's cloth clothing in the Carpathian regions is the leather wide belt or cheres that was worn to assist with work in the forests and fields. These belts were thickly decorated with metal studs, leather straps, and braiding and other leather tooling techniques. They helped to support the back and to offer a sturdy base for carrying heavy logs, and would often have a spot to carry an axe and a knife, similar to a modern tool belt. The two northwesternmost regions of Ukraine are Volyn and Polisia, which are bordered by modern-day Poland and Belarus. The clothing, music, and dance steps of these two regions overlap, with the chief difference being that Volhynia is located in a more forested landscape and Polisia in a more marshy wetlands. Basic clothing pieces in these two regions are made of woven linen fabrics. The dominant colors in Polisia are red and white, while there is a wider variety of color in Volhynia, including darker homespun fabrics that are used for skirts and pants, and blue and gray fabrics used for vests and coats. The women's vests in both regions are distinctive due to the peplum detail at the waist, similar to Polish folk clothing. In the farthest northwestern part of Ukraine, the most prevalent fabric used in traditional clothing was of woven linen, often dyed red or another dark color, in a vertical or horizontal striped pattern. Full or pleated skirts, similar in style to those of neighboring Poland, and embroidered linen aprons were worn for weddings and other festive occasions. A woven plaid design was sometimes used, with red as the dominant color, and the apron made of striped linen. When cloth became more available for purchase, wide pleated skirts became more prevalent, often red with rows of ribbons sewn along the bottom. A corset or vest in one of two styles was also worn over the sorochka, either one with flaps at the waist or a simple short vest with front lacings more similar to those worn in Belarus. Men traditionally wore pants and shirts made of white or unbleached linen with highly embroidered front panels and fold-down collars. They would also wear a long coat decorated with braid or cord trim on the front and embroidery on the back. When not going barefoot, the original footwear in this region, as in many of the western parts of Ukraine, were postole, or flat shoe woven of birch or linen bark and worn over linen leg cloths and laced up the leg to keep them in place. When people could afford them, boots were the preferred choice of footwear. Women's boots tended to be a lace-up, ankle length, similar to those worn in Poland. The Polisa region, which overlaps Volyn, is located slightly north and east, bordering more extensively with Belarus. The clothing and dance steps of the two regions are very similar. However, the traditional folk clothing of this area is distinctive in its use of white or unbleached linen, highly decorated or woven with predominantly red threads. As you can see, stage costumes have expanded the color palette, but the original components of the folk clothing remain. Shirts and blouses with thickly embroidered designs and folded down collars, full skirts with horizontal striped trim, and natural colored striped pants with a narrower silhouette are modeled on the original folk clothing worn in Polisia. The embroidery style of Polisia is quite unique, as it attempts to copy the woven patterns of the linen skirts and aprons. It is sometimes hard to tell if a piece is woven or embroidered. Cross-stitch patterns are also traditionally used and sometimes incorporate small amounts of black, white, and other darker colors. probably the most recognizable Ukrainian costume in Central Ukrainian costume the dancers wear when performing the hopak, the national dance of Ukraine. With satin and velvet fabrics, rich red and black embroidery, colorful flowers and flowing ribbons, the hopak is a visual spectacle enhanced by the beautiful colors and designs of the clothing. The original folk clothing that the Central Ukrainian stage costume is modeled on had all of the same components as the modern hopak costume, but was made with simpler fabrics and color palettes. The most fundamental garment of Ukrainian national clothing is the sorochka, which means shirt. It is more accurately a long-sleeved tunic, longer for women than for men, that is decorated with embroidery on the front, sleeves, and hem. The sorochka is the oldest form of Ukrainian folk clothing and has remained in use the longest, worn throughout the country with regional variations in style. In the central Ukrainian regions around Kyiv and Poltava, the sleeves of the sorochka were generally wider than in other regions of Ukraine. The original embroidery was done using undyed linen threads, creating a white-on-white pattern. Over time, the colors red, black, and blue became more prevalent, incorporating both floral and geometric designs. Women would wear a woolen skirt called a plachta, woven in a distinctive checkered pattern. This was worn over the sorochka and held in place with poyas, or long wrapped woven belt. The front ends of the plachta do not meet, and the open space is covered with a colorful apron. The men whose loose pants made of woven linen as in other regions, and these were left undyed for daily wear and dyed for festive wear, with red and dark blue being the most popular colors. The major regional differences were in the width of the pant legs. In the southern steppe regions of Ukraine, the sharovari developed by the Cossack warriors were the widest and fullest of the styles. The sorochka is worn tucked into the pants, and everything was held in place by a woven poyas, modeled on the Turkish style. Head coverings were also essential to the folk clothing of central Ukraine. Men often wore a sheep or lambskin hat called a shapka. Unmarried women usually did not wear a head covering but wore their hair braided, perhaps adding a ribbon to the end of the braid, which they could then wrap around their head when working. For festivals, these young women would wear a vinok, or wreath made of fresh flowers, grasses, and herbs in the spring and summer, or of artificial flowers made from a variety of materials. Wedding vinoks were exceptionally rich in design and ornamentation. Long ribbons were attached to the back of the headpiece, with each color of ribbon and variety of flower having a special meaning for the bridal couple. Married women always covered their heads with either an embroidered cap, a long white linen scarf, or a floral patterned kerchief or shawl. Multiple strands of coral or amber beads were popular, as well as necklaces made of the most accessible glass and wooden beads. The well-known red boots worn by both women and men are a relatively modern addition to the costume. Although Cossacks wore boots as part of their battle uniform, most people wore flat woven or leather pistolets similar to those worn throughout Ukraine. As you can see, the original folk clothing made of simple homemade fabrics has developed into a richer look using manufactured fabrics such as velvet and satin to provide a more vibrant visual impact. The velvet vest or korsetka, which is widely pleated at the back and decorated with applique or embroidery on the front, is an essential part of the women's costume. The length, general shape, number of pleats, and decorative design varied widely from village to village. Women sometimes wore a sleeve jacket of similar style, usually colored white, as an overcoat. Men also wore an overcoat with a pleated back for ease of movement. As we have tried to show you, the folk clothing of the Ukrainian people has evolved over many hundreds of years into the stage costumes of today. National dress is not something frozen for all time, but changes and adapts as economies and technology develop. As the world has become more connected, cultural differences and rituals have become less important to life on a daily basis, but through cultural organizations and Canada's multicultural policy, we have been able to continue to celebrate the unique qualities of our mother cultures, as well as gaining a better understanding of the things all cultures share. We are lucky that we have been able to preserve and understand something of the culture of our ancestors and to celebrate it through song, music, and dance. If you would like to learn more about Ukrainian clothing, some links will be posted at the end of this presentation. Happy exploring!
Welcome back to Costume Treasures from Baba's Trunk to the Stage. I'm sure you all enjoyed watching the very informative video that Janice Beck and some of our volunteers here prepared for us. And in a moment, we're going to be going live with Janice and asking her some questions. But before I do, I'd just like to inform our viewers that we are now officially sold out of our pierogi and borscht sales. So thank you so very, very much for supporting our organization, and we look forward to welcome you in our hall one of these days when we can once again serve our cooked pierogis to you during one of our pierogi lunches. So at this time, just to let you know that after the Q&A with Janice, we will be showing you another video, a short video on a costume fashion show that we did here at our hall back in 2011. But first, I'm going to turn my attention to my very dear friend, Janice Beck. Janice has been involved in our organization all of her life. Really, when I say all of her life, she and I met when we were each 3 and 4 years old, respectively. I won't say who's older, but close enough. She is following in the footsteps of her parents and grandparents. And it is her love of her culture that has seen her talents truly shine, from cross-stitch, embroidery, to piss and key decorating, to beading. But her true gift is her ability to research, design, and sew the beautiful costumes of the Dovbush Dancers that have allowed us to build a wardrobe second to none. And so, Jan, just sort of welcome first of all, and thank you so much. It really is a beautiful tribute to costumes, and it'll be something that we will be keeping forever and will be able to pass down as a legacy for future generations. The video we just watched was fairly comprehensive in providing us with a lot of specific detail on the regional peculiarities of the costume pieces, as well as the journey of costumes from village to the stage, as we talked about. But perhaps you can give us a little bit of insight. I've seen some of the older pieces of costuming and how they were sewn. I mean, you from way back then to where they are now. Previously, they were square pieces of fabric and cloth embroidered, sewn together, to where today, dancers are measured and within centimeters of their bodies and stuff like that. Costumes are sewn. So just maybe if you could just give us a little insight into costume making, perhaps?
Sure. Back in the olden days, I guess, in the old country, when people started sewing their clothing, they used the materials that they had at hand. So they would weave their own wool from their sheeps. They would dye with plants from nature, and so everything came from that basic what do we have around us kind of position. So you would weave a piece of fabric with a design in it, and instead of cutting it like we would with store-bought fabrics, they would take the rectangle and they would maybe cut a section out, so you would have a body, and then you would have sleeves, and you cut a hole for your head and put it over, and that's what you used. You sewed the arm sleeves, seams, and the side seams. And then, you would add maybe a piece in a triangle shape under the arms so that you could lift your arms and move to do your daily work. You would put an apron on this to give yourself a waist and protect the fabric. If you were a man, you would have your pants using a very wide piece of fabric so that you had room to move while you were working in your fields or herding your sheep. So, your day-to-day clothing that we consider costumes now, were very basic. Now, if we are making costumes for stage, you're right, we measure every part of the dancer's body. You want it to be custom made to fit them as closely as you can so that you can see their movements when they're on stage. And the fabrics are modern, factory made for the most part, unlike in the old clothing that we have from, the original immigrants.
So there's a question here from one of our ex-dancers. What is a costume you're most proud of making? Because I know that you were instrumental from the very beginning of sort of designing and making so many of our costumes and outfitting the group. So what is one that you can say is
Okay, I'll give you a little background first. I was really lucky when I got started working with Dovbush Costumes, that we had an extensive costume wardrobe already. We had 40 years worth of costumes that were brought back from Ukraine when dance groups in the past went, and we had clothing that was handmade by people, red skirts and with ribbons and hand embroidered vests from even prior to that. So I had that as a basis. And I've done a lot of research over the years to try to enhance what we have and maybe expand our regional costumes. So I think one of the ones I'm most proud of is our Polician costumes, which you saw in the video. It was a cream skirt with all the wide pieces of ribbon along the bottom, because I had to modify vests from something we already had in our wardrobe and retrim them all. I had to design the patterns for the skirts and make sure I could source all the materials that I needed. And then the headpieces that I do always. If you look to the left here, you can see some of the headpieces that I've made, and bits and pieces of those costumes are my favorite, but the overall costume is that Polician one.
Thank you.
It looks really impressive on stage.
Well, and I was very impressed with it as well. I think it's just absolutely gorgeous. Another question, same person. Are there any challenges that are unique to designing costumes for dancers as opposed to other performers?
You have to make sure that whatever they're wearing is not going to get caught on the heels of your shoes or the scenery around you on the stage. So even if you've got a full skirt, you have to make sure it's something that's going to move easily so it doesn't get tangled in something. You have to make sure that the fabric sometimes has a bit of stretch in it so that the dancers, again, their movements aren't impeded by what they're wearing. And the other thing is because we are a volunteer group, we're not a professional group where you can have a set of costumes for each professional dancer that become their own while they're in there. I have to make sure all the costumes can be able to fit anybody. So if I have a 5'2" girl and a 5'7" girl comes in to replace her as one retires and one continues, I have to be able to find a way to make sure that that costume can be adjusted to whoever the new dancer is.
Thank you. And just, I guess maybe we should have even begun with a lot of the accessories that I see flanking you there. Headpieces you mentioned, and to your right there are some very interesting beads.
Yeah, this is something that you don't usually see when you see a costume on stage. You're looking at the overall picture, but accessories are really important because that gives you the complete feel of what the costume should look like. So I've got a lot of necklaces here to my right that are traditional but from different regions of Ukraine. So there's a lot of beading in the necklaces. All the long red ones here are made of coral beads, and that was very common And the smaller they were, the more expensive they were because they took a lot more tooling to make. And the more strands you had really represented your wealth because they were not easy to purchase. There's also amber. This one at the very front is an amber, made of amber beads, and they were very easily found and traded with the Baltic states that are nearby. And then a lot of the western regions where our relatives came from used small seed beads, glass beads, and did net beading, which would give you a whole collar of beads. And that's a very common thing in Bukovina and the Hutsul parts of the country, and just that whole western Ukrainian region, you'll see them. So.
Yeah, and I thank you for the beading, the fact that you are a beader as well as a sewer,
it's
being able to complement our costumes and finish them off.
Self-taught skill. Anybody can look it up on the internet, and it'll keep you busy for a lot of evenings.
So, question to you, Jan, is what do you do to make the costumes adjustable? Like, what are some of the tricks of the trade, so to speak?
Tricks of the trade, lace up fronts on vests is really helpful, for the girls especially, because, people are different sizes in the waist and the bust and that kind of thing. Skirts, finding elastic waists and making them longer, and then putting a seam part way up where it's hidden so that you can lengthen it if you need to. For pants for the guys, making them long but making sure that they can loop over their foot inside their boots so that if they are too long, you can pull them up without having them come out of the boots. Lots of with hats, putting a band inside the hat if the hat's too big to hold it in place. So yeah, and making the headpieces over here, I make in 3 different sizes, all about a 1/2 inch different because everybody's head is a slightly different size with elastic at the back.
So not quite one size fits all, but definitely 3 sizes we can usually cover.
3 sizes that'll cover everybody, and yeah, can be adjusted.
Exactly. So in viewing the video, we talked about costumes found in the village versus those that we see today. And as someone who creates and designs costumes, there's a certain amount of artistic freedom that takes place in your design. And sometimes you'll have, you might base it on what you see, but have this intuition that you just want to go in this direction. You start working with a bit of a color palette. Can you just explain how far of an artistic freedom or expression do you use in designing those costumes?
It really does depend on who the costume designer is and who the director of the dance group is that you're making them for. I know there are a lot of dance groups that I've seen that have taken the basic traditional style, I'm going to say the Hutsul costume, where the girls have the apron style skirt that's a panel in the front, panel in the back, and then you have your vest with the fur trim. And the traditional colors there are orange, red, yellow, and green, which reflect nature from the mountainous area of Ukraine. And they've gone with purple and bright pink and turquoise and lime green, and it's beautiful when you look at it from stage, but it's very non-traditional, and I have a real personal problem with that, because if we're supposed to be reflecting the culture, you have to take color palette into consideration as well. So when I do it, I take a look at what the basic design is from that region. I look at what we already have in our wardrobe that I might need to match it to, and then I can use my creativity from there. And the Polisian costumes I was talking about that I was really excited to make and I'm really proud of, I've added a lot of green into that costume, which is not normal for that region. It's usually white and red are the basic colors. But for stage, I've added a bit of dimension with some green and maybe a little bit of yellow, but I've tried to stick to the basic white skirt with rows of colored trim that you would see in the traditional costumes. So I don't want to venture too far from the base of what the traditional costume would be, but then look and see what I can source locally to go with it.
And living in Vancouver, there's only so many resources that we have available to us, only so many fabric stores, and I know that you are continually on the hunt for different, even weights of fabric, so that they're not too heavy for the dancers and stuff like that. And you have a very keen sense on, finding that perfect sort of fabric, and also being able to find it at a price, and you wait until it goes on sale, you wait till you find your coupons, and then you go and you buy it. And I know that we've for all the fundraising activities we do to buy and purchase costumes if necessary from Ukraine, the ones that you make for us are second to none, and always at a bargain, very good bargain.
We are a volunteer organization, so we don't have a lot of extra money. We don't get grants like, say, a group in Edmonton, Shumka, gets nationally to costume production. So you have to work with what you've got. And I am a budget shopper. I can make skirts, I can make pants, I can make vests, I can make headpieces, I can make beaded jewelry, but I can't do any of the embroidered pieces. The cost of that would be incredibly out of reach for us, so that we order from Ukraine. Everything
and
else,
labor intensive.
Yeah, and labor intensive. So footwear and embroidered pieces come from the costume factories that we can now access in Ukraine, which we couldn't 25, 30 years ago.
Exactly.
Everything else can be made locally, and we have a tradition of that. We've been doing it for almost 100 years, making our own costumes here in Vancouver. So.
But we've been getting a lot better of it thanks to people like you.
Well, thank you, and thank you to my volunteer crew who does the sewing once I've got it designed and cut out. So
that, and even, I remember making Vinox one day here at the hall, and we had all of the girls, because the girls wear them, downstairs and making them.
Yep.
And it's sort of neat that you shared your experience and knowledge with them, and had them there learning that art, well, and it really is an art.
I mean, the first costume that I think I made for the dance group was a set of circle green skirts that we stamped with sunflowers and hand painted the design on. And I had a whole crew of about 20 parents on Saturday mornings that would come down while their kids were dancing, and I'd have them painting the skirts. And we've got a dozen of those skirts, and they'll be there for hopefully another 100 years.
Absolutely. Question to you, Janice. Were you a dancer at one time too? And has that experience shaped your design skills? And if so, how?
Yeah, I was a dancer. I actually danced from the time I was 3 years old till I was in my early 30s. And I was a member of the senior dance group here when I was in my late teens and 20s. And we made all of our own costumes. We did not have access to costumes from Ukraine. And we, at that time, were expanding into trying to make regional costumes. So that was my first experience with the idea of designing and making your own costumes and being authentic. And I sewed them for the dancers now. The dancers actually sewed them themselves. And so that gave me, with my 2 years of high school sewing, a lot of insight into what the costumes should look like and how to make them authentic. And and it was always, I remember sewing till like 2 o'clock in the morning because we had a concert at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You were there, sitting up and sewing that last snap on. And when you went on stage wearing those, you always felt so proud because you'd had a hand in making them. And for me now, the pride is watching my daughters and your daughters and all of these young people go out there in something that I've designed and made. Yeah. And I don't get paid enough, believe me.
I know.
For the time I put in. But it's not about that. My payment is seeing it on stage.
Yeah. No, and I remember getting, patterns cut out of newspaper when we were dancing,
right?
Yeah,
we'd buy one pattern, and then we'd have the costume designer cut out a pattern for each of us to take home out of newspaper, and then go home and make your own.
And the question was never asked who's sewing it. You were just given the pattern.
Here you go, here's your fabric, here's your pattern.
Get it done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is there anything else that perhaps you didn't put in the video, that something that you're thinking I would like to share this with our audience?
Probably 1,000 things, but I don't think I can think of them offhand. But I think the thing that I really want people to know is that I'm hoping that I can pass my knowledge down to the next generation of dancers, because it's something I've had a passion for. I've learned all kinds of Ukrainian arts and crafts, but dance has always been my first love, and I want the next generation, the young dancers, to find someone who has that same passion and take it over so that we can keep growing this dance group and wardrobe.
Thank you. And I think it's also nice to let the viewers know that we are a national organization, that there are centers across Canada who have dance groups, choir, orchestra groups, and the costumes, while we have a very extensive costume wardrobe here in Vancouver, the wardrobes nationally are huge. And we're so very fortunate to be able to have an organization such that we do that, as and now I'm speaking about Dovbush, that we can come to a hall and to rehearse, but that houses all these costumes, that provides storage for them, assists in the purchasing of costumes. Many of us can get grants from our national body to be able to get some funding to help with costuming, and I think it enriches the audience experience, because the dancer is then not wearing that same piece of costuming, from the beginning to the end of the show. It's they can see that the music fits the costumes, fits the choreography, fits everything that's being presented on stage. And if one of those is lacking, it sort of falls short a little bit. And I think just having you creating all these lovely costumes for Dovbush and for the school, because you've done sewing for the school over the years, just really ensures that what we are presenting is as close and true and authentic to what it should be. And I thank you for that, and the organization thanks you for that. So I think if there's nothing else, and I don't see any thing else coming through here, I think we'll leave the Q&A at this time. I will again remind the viewers that we are going to be moving on to the fashion show. It was called Off the Bar, and it's a fashion show that was, we produced it, we ran it, we built this catwalk even for the fashion show, and it was something that we thought we would sort of experiment with it maybe a little bit with the choreography. We absolutely took artistic freedom in the production of it, but it was a fun thing that we did, and it again gave the audience what it could look like authentically, and then sort of just went out on a couple different limbs, but it was a fun thing to do, and it's a fun way to explore costumes. So for our viewers, again, thank you, Janice. For our viewers, what we're going to do is we're going to be showing the video in a moment. I would like to remind people that at 3 p.m., live from our stage here, we'll have a few people giving the closing festival remarks, and people will be able to continue with the live stream, to see it online. And we, from the bottom of our hearts, we would like to thank the Heart of the City Festival Committee for providing us with the opportunity to share all of these wonderful videos with you. And while the typical, concert and end of the festival dinner is not taking place, these are very valuable videos and legacies that will be part of our legacy for generations to come. And just a reminder that we will have them eventually up on our website and to share with everyone, and hopefully you can find your recipes there, find ones from the past season. And so at this time, we will say goodbye, and we hope to have you all back joining us online at 3. Thank you so much.
Ukraine is a land of color, passion, and pride. We wish to share with you our culture and history, and welcome you to a tour of the rainbow colors and designs of the costumes of Ukraine, with the traditional reading of bread and song.